Something tried to take her life and it wasn't natural. She survived, but the attack didn't stop. What if I told you this wasn't coincidence but a targeted spiritual assault? What if the one behind it is still watching, still waiting? An ex insider has broken the silence, and what she revealed will shake you. You are about to see what most people are too blind or too afraid to confront. She did not understand it at first. It began quietly, almost invisibly, a sudden heaviness in the room, feeling that something was watching but no one was there. Lights flickering without reason. Strange, repeated nightmares that felt more real than waking life. You may think this is normal. You may call it stress. You may call it anxiety. But what she experienced was something else entirely, because the pattern did not stop. It escalated. Her health began to collapse without explanation. Doctors could not find the root. Tests came back clean, yet her body kept failing. Have you ever felt that? When everything says you should be fine, but something inside you knows you are not. This is how spiritual attacks begin. Not loud, not obvious, but strategic, calculated, targeted. She started losing strength day by day, not just physical strength, but emotional and spiritual clarity. Her thoughts became foggy. Her peace disappeared. Her sleep turned into a battlefield. Every night, the same presence, watching, waiting, closing in. You need to understand something most people ignore: spiritual warfare rarely announces itself. It hides behind normal life. It disguises itself as coincidence. But when patterns repeat, when destruction follows you without reason, you are not dealing with chance. You are dealing with intention. And that's exactly what she was facing. An intentional attack. She began noticing strange things around her home. Objects slightly moved. Unexplained scratches. A constant tension in certain corners of the house. There were places she avoided without knowing why. Have you ever walked into a room and felt immediate discomfort, like something is wrong, but you can't explain it? That is not imagination. That is sensitivity. And she was becoming more sensitive because the attack was intensifying. Then came the turning point. One night, she woke up unable to move, her body frozen, her voice locked, but her mind fully awake, and in that moment she felt it, a presence beside her, heavy, dark, oppressive, not human. It wasn't sleep paralysis, it was a direct encounter. Because this time it spoke, not with words but with force. A pressure that screamed one message: you don't belong here anymore. That was the moment everything changed. Because now it was no longer subtle. It was direct, aggressive, relentless. And here is what you must understand: when spiritual attacks reach this level, it means something has been opened. A door, an access point. And in many cases, it doesn't open by accident. She began searching for answers, desperate, terrified, confused, until she met someone who had once been inside that world. An ex-practitioner, someone who had done what others fear to even speak about. And what that person revealed shattered everything, because this wasn't random. She was targeted, specifically, intentionally. Someone had marked her, not physically, spiritually. You need to hear this clearly. Not every attack comes from strangers. Sometimes it comes from people who know you, people who smile with you, people who sit near you, people who know your routines, your weaknesses, your access points. And according to what was revealed, she had unknowingly crossed paths with someone operating in darkness, someone who does not fight with hands, but with rituals, with intention, with spiritual manipulation. At first, she resisted the idea. It felt too extreme, too unbelievable. But the evidence kept building. The patterns aligned too perfectly. Every time she made progress, something would pull her back. Every time she tried to move forward, resistance appeared. Have you experienced that? Progress suddenly blocked, opportunities collapsing without reason, peace constantly interrupted. That is not always coincidence. Sometimes it is interference. And in her case, it became undeniable because the attacks became personal, targeted at her mind, her identity, her purpose. She began hearing thoughts that were not hers, whispers of doubt, fear injected without cause, a constant pressure telling her to give up. This is one of the most dangerous forms of attack, not physical, but mental, because if your mind is captured, your life will follow. And that is exactly the strategy. Break the mind, control the outcome. She was being pushed toward one thing: surrender, not to peace, but to destruction. And this is where most people lose the battle, because they don't recognize the war. They think it's just life being hard. They think it's just bad luck. But you need to wake up. because what almost took her. Life was not natural, and what kept coming after her was not random. It was coordinated, and it had one goal: to remove her, silently, completely. But here's what they didn't expect: she didn't break. Even when everything inside her was shaking, even when fear surrounded her, even when the attacks became unbearable, something inside her refused to surrender. And that is where the shift began, because the moment you resist, the moment you refuse to bow, the moment you begin to question what's really happening, you step out of blindness and into awareness. And awareness is the first weapon, but it is not the last, because what she was about to uncover next would expose the system behind the attack. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Awareness opened her eyes, but it also made the battle more visible. And what she saw next was not random chaos, it was structure, it was system, it was organized. Because when the ex-insider began to speak, every unexplained moment suddenly had a pattern. Nothing was accidental, nothing was just happening, it was being orchestrated. You need to understand this clearly. Dark operations do not rely on chance, they rely on access. Access to your life, access to your space, access to your identity. And once access is gained, the attacks become easier, stronger, more precise. The ex-insider revealed something that most people refuse to believe. Attacks often begin with small permissions, something you allowed, something you ignored, something you thought was harmless. And that small opening becomes a doorway. In her case, it traced back to a connection, a person she trusted, someone who had been close enough to study her life, close enough to know her patterns, close enough to create a link. This is how targeting begins. Not from distance, but from proximity. You don't have to invite darkness directly. Sometimes it enters through people who carry it. And when that connection is established, the next phase begins. Monitoring. Yes, monitoring, not through cameras, but through spiritual observation. Tracking your emotions, tracking your reactions, tracking your weak points. Because every weakness becomes an entry point. Have you noticed certain moments when you feel unusually drained? Without reason? Without reason? When your thoughts shift without warning? Those are not always natural fluctuations. Sometimes they are responses to pressure being applied. And she began to see it clearly. Every time she felt fear, the activity increased. Every time she felt hopeless, the attacks intensified. Because fear is not just an emotion, it is an opening, and the system feeds on it. The ex-insider explained it without hesitation. They don't just attack randomly, they wait for alignment. Alignment of your weakness, alignment of your environment, alignment of your isolation. And once those align, they strike. That's why the attacks became stronger when she was alone. That's why nights were worse than days. That's why silence became heavy. Because isolation amplifies vulnerability, and vulnerability attracts pressure. But here is where it gets even more serious. The ex-insider revealed that once a person is targeted, the goal is escalation. They don't stop at discomfort. They move toward destruction slowly, strategically. First your peace, then your clarity, then your strength, then your will, until you feel like there is nothing left. And that is where she was heading. Everything began slipping. Relationships strained without clear reason. Opportunities disappeared at the last moment. Unexpected conflicts kept rising. It felt like her life was being dismantled piece by piece. And she kept asking the same question: why is everything falling apart at once? The answer was devastating, because it wasn't everything. It was targeted dismantling. When something wants to remove you, it doesn't attack one area. It attacks multiple areas at once, so you feel overwhelmed, confused, unable to fight back. And this is where most people collapse. Not because they are weak, but because they are surrounded, attacked from different angles at the same time. But she began to notice something critical: patterns, repeated cycles, the same type of problem appearing again and again, different forms, same effect. And that's when the ex-insider confirmed it. Repetition is a signature that something is being maintained, sustained, repeated intentionally, because random problems don't repeat in identical patterns, but controlled interference does. You need to ask yourself something right now. What patterns keep repeating in your life? What problems return even after you solve them? What cycle refuses to break? Because sometimes the issue is not what you see, it's what's sustaining it behind the scenes. And once she recognized the patterns, she also recognized the triggers: specific times, specific emotions, specific environments, moments where everything would suddenly shift. And that's when she realized This was not just external, it was also internal. The system was trying to influence her from the inside, through thoughts, through feelings, through pressure. Because if they can control your internal state, they don't need to control your environment. You will destroy your own stability. That's the highest level of manipulation. And she was dangerously close to that point, questioning herself, doubting her reality, losing grip on what was real and what was being influenced. But something interrupted that descent. Truth, raw, unfiltered, uncomfortable truth. The ex-insider didn't just explain the attack, they exposed the strategy to break it. And it started with one powerful realization: you are not powerless. That statement changed everything. Because up until that moment, she believed she was a victim. But victims don't fight, and fighters don't surrender. The moment she shifted her identity, the battle shifted. Because the system relies on one thing: your agreement, your acceptance, your silence. And the moment you withdraw that agreement, resistance begins. But resistance alone is not enough. Because what she was about to learn next was how to actively push back, how to close the access, how to break the pattern, and how to reclaim control. But understand this: once you begin to resist, the pressure may increase. Because what once moved freely is now being challenged. And that leads to confrontation, a direct clash. And what she faced next was not subtle, it was open, aggressive, final. The moment she resisted, everything changed. Not quietly, not gradually, violently. The pressure didn't fade, it surged. Because what once moved freely in her life was now being confronted, and confrontation always exposes what was hidden. You need to understand this. When you stop agreeing with darkness, darkness doesn't walk away peacefully. It reacts, it pushes back, it tries to re-establish control. And that is exactly what happened. The atmosphere in her home shifted overnight. What was once subtle became aggressive. Sharp noises in the middle of the night, unexplained movements that could no longer be ignored, a constant sense that something was trying to provoke fear intentionally. This was no longer observation, this was intimidation. Because when control begins to slip, intimidation is the next tactic. Make you afraid again, make you doubt your resistance, you retreat. But she didn't retreat. Even though fear tried to rise, she held her ground. And that's when the attacks turned inward, stronger than before. Her mind became the battlefield. Thoughts invaded without permission. Dark, intrusive ideas that did not feel like her own. A constant pressure telling her she was losing, that she was alone, that she could not win. You may have experienced this. Those sudden thoughts that don't match who you are. That voice that pushes you toward fear, doubt, toward giving up. That is not always your own thinking. And this is where many people lose control. Because they believe every thought belongs to them. But in spiritual warfare, thoughts can be influenced, injected, repeated until they feel real. And if you accept them, they take root. That was the plan. To make her accept the narrative: you are weak, you are finished, you cannot escape this. But something inside her refused to agree. Even when the thoughts came, she questioned them. Even when fear rose, she challenged it. And that resistance began to disrupt the pattern. Because the system depends on agreement. Without agreement, it loses stability. And that instability began to show. The attacks became inconsistent, unpredictable, almost desperate. Moments of intense pressure, followed by sudden silence, as if something was trying to regain control and failing. This is a critical moment in any battle, when the opposition realizes it is losing ground, and instead of subtlety, it becomes reckless. That's when she experienced the most direct confrontation. One night, the pressure returned stronger than ever, but this time something was different. She was not frozen, she was not silent, she was aware, fully aware. The presence was there again, heavy, oppressive. But instead of shrinking, she spoke, not with fear, with authority, a command, a refusal, a declaration that this had no right to remain. And in that moment, everything reacted. The atmosphere shifted violently. The pressure spiked, then broke, like something snapping, like a grip being released. And then silence, for the first time, real silence. Not empty, not heavy, clear. You need to understand what just happened. She did not escape. She confronted. And confrontation broke the pattern. Because authority was activated. Real authority. Not based on emotion. Not based on fear. But based on truth. And truth has weight. Power. Force. The ex-insider had warned her: they rely on your silence more than your fear. Because silence allows continuation. But confrontation forces exposure, and exposure weakens control. From that moment, everything began to shift, not instantly perfect, but different. The constant pressure lifted, the repeated patterns began to break. Situations that once collapsed started stabilizing, and most importantly, her mind became clear again. That fog, that confusion, that constant mental pressure, gone. And that's when she realized something deeper. The battle was never just external, it was about control. Control of her environment, control of her thoughts, control of her identity. And once she reclaimed control, the system could no longer operate the same way. But here's the part you cannot ignore: the fight didn't end, it changed. Because once you break free, you become aware. And awareness makes you a threat to anything that operates in secrecy. And that means one thing: you must remain alert, you must remain grounded, you must remain in authority. Because what she experienced next was not another attack, it was something more dangerous: an attempt to return. Not with force, but with deception. After the confrontation, she expected relief. She expected everything to end. But what came instead was subtle, quiet, almost invisible. Because when force fails, deception begins. That is the final strategy. Not pressure, not fear, but confusion disguised as normality. At first, everything seemed calm, too calm. The intensity that once surrounded her life had disappeared, but something felt off. Have you ever experienced that? When the storm stops but the air still feels heavy? That was her new reality. No more loud disturbances, no more overwhelming pressure, no more visible attacks. But in its place came uncertainty, small doubts returning, tiny emotional shifts that didn't belong. Moments where she questioned if it was truly over or just paused. And that's exactly where the danger lies. Because silence after chaos is not always peace. Sometimes it is recalibration. The ex-insider had warned about this stage: when direct control fails, influence becomes indirect. And that is exactly what began to happen. Instead of attacking her directly, circumstances around her began to shift again. Not dramatically, subtly. A conversation that triggers doubt, a memory that resurfaces unexpectedly, a coincidence that feels too aligned to ignore. These things do not look like attacks, they look like life. But their timing, their repetition, their emotional impact reveals a deeper pattern. Because when influence replaces force, everything becomes psychological. And psychological warfare is the hardest to recognize. She started noticing something strange: old fears resurfacing at unexpected moments. Not constant, but timed, almost strategic, just enough to destabilize her thoughts, but not enough to be obvious. And that is the key: subtle disruption. Because subtle disruption leads to self-doubt, and self-doubt leads to hesitation, and hesitation weakens authority. But something had changed in her. She was no longer unaware. She recognized the pattern, and recognition breaks invisibility. The moment you identify manipulation, it loses power over you. And that is what began to happen. She stopped reacting emotionally. She started observing. Instead of fear, she analyzed. Instead of confusion, she paused. Instead of impulsive response, she grounded herself, and that shift changed everything. System relies on reaction. No reaction, no control. Still, the pressure tried one last approach. It returned through relationships, people misunderstanding her, unexpected tension with others, situations that created emotional strain. Not enough to break her, but enough to test her stability. This is the final stage of influence: disruption through connection. Because if you cannot be broken internally, they attempt to destabilize you externally. But she had already learned something critical. Not every emotional disturbance is personal. Not every conflict is meaningful. Not every shift requires response. Sometimes silence is resistance, and distance is protection. So she stopped feeding the cycles, stopped engaging with unnecessary tension, stopped reacting to emotional triggers, stopped interpreting every situation as a threat. And slowly, the influence weakened, not because it disappeared, but because it lost engagement. And without engagement, influence cannot sustain itself. This is where the real breakthrough happened. Clarity returned. Not emotional clarity, but mental clarity. She began to see her life differently. Patterns became obvious. Emotional triggers became recognizable. Situations that once felt overwhelming now felt manageable. And most importantly, she no longer felt hunted. She felt aware. And awareness is freedom. But the most powerful realization came from the ex-insider's final truth. You were never trapped. You were just targeted into forgetting. Your authority. That sentence changed everything because it reframed the entire experience, not as helplessness, but as interference. And interference can be stopped, not by fear, not by panic, but by awareness, grounding, and refusal to participate in manipulation. She rebuilt her mental boundaries, reclaimed her emotional stability, and slowly her life began to normalize again. Not because everything outside changed, but because she changed how she responded. And that is the real victory. Not escaping the world, but regaining control within it. Now she carries one truth with her. What almost destroyed her only had power while she didn't recognize it. And once she recognized it, the power dissolved, not instantly, but completely. And what remains now is not fear, but strength. Quiet strength, the kind that cannot be shaken easily again. Because once you have seen how influence works, you stop living unconsciously, you start living aware. And awareness changes everything. You are not powerless in the face of what tries to overwhelm you. What once felt like control only survives in silence and ignorance. The moment you see the pattern, it begins to lose its grip. The moment you refuse fear, the structure begins to weaken. Stand firm in awareness, not panic. Stand firm in clarity, not confusion. And what was meant to break you becomes the very thing that awakens you.